Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Um, Today, we will be doing Learning Unit 6, Theme 1, which is supplier relationship management. I think this topic is a really nice topic because it allows for everybody to be very creative in how they view supplier relationships, within your current organization, or even if it's um, whether you have a supplier or you are a supplier yourself. I'm just going to share my screen, and we're obviously going to go through some of the benefits, some of the different relationships that's sort of, proper supply chain terminology when we talk about supplier relationship management. And as we go along, I mean, if you have any questions, you just shout or, pick up your hand and we can work on it from there. And for some reason, I thought on our I did block it off. So there is next week will be on customer relationship management, which is really nice topic. And then the third theme is actually business ethics, which is actually very nice as well. I think these three topics from a Learning Unit 6 perspective, it allows you to be a lot more creative with your thinking. Almost 90% of the time, supplier relationship, customer relationship, and business ethics comes through in your examination. But I'll share more information closer to our last session, just so that you have more indication of what to expect from your, from your examination itself. I don't have view of it, but what I tend to do is I try and pull as many past papers as I possibly can, and I put together a little document for you. And we go through it in our last session, just so that this is what your focus should be on. I'm not telling you to steer away from the entire MO, but I'm just letting you know that this is more on the commonly asked learning units or themes, and maybe have a little bit more focus. I do see that your particular examination is a scene examination. Most times what happens with the scene examination, from my experience, is they will give you a case study in advance for you to read and understand. So when you go through to the examination, you already sort of know what your case study is, and you're not blindsided by a specific case study. I will have more information closer to time. So on the 29th, when we have our last live lecture, I will have a lot more information for you, and quite possibly, if we can, maybe just go over certain topics with the case study and pick on a certain topics. Okay. So when we talk about supplier relationship management itself, it's the relationship specifically between a buyer and a seller. So the textbook terminology is it's a strategic, process-oriented, cross-functional, and value-creating for a buyer and seller, and a means of achieving superior financial performance. So in layman's terms, it's a transaction between two individuals, so buyer and seller, and it's completely based on financial means or financial purposes from a purchasing perspective. So supplier relationship management is a systematic process and an approach that organizations embark on to minimize supply disruptions and deliver long-term growth. So it is a sort of relationship-based process between a buyer and a seller, where what happens is a business of where a buyer is basically situated needs to have control over their sources, whether it's their raw materials, whether it's a component of some sort that goes into a finished product, just so that they can cover themselves from a risk perspective. So a lot of businesses, what they do is they look at their management of supplier relationships from a very strategic perspective, where they use that relationship and allow for their suppliers to be a part of their business. So, for instance, if you have a supplier, let's say they are in a manufacturing perspective, they possibly produce a component that fits into your product. You always have this relationship with your supplier where you're going to them and asking them for advice on what new technology and innovations in the market, what can they do better that can help you make a better product. And that's how the buyer and supplier relationships basically evolve. And it's really nice from a supply chain perspective because it allows your supply chain to, number one, be absolutely resilient, because it's something that would continuously happen and continuously go forward, and you wouldn't have any sort of breakage or stop in your specific supply chain, purely because you are always getting full supply of your raw material or your components or work in progress. Or even if you are a retailer, and you're buying a finished product, you are getting your finished product without any delays in delivery. Okay. Then we're going on into different types of supplier relationships. So the first relationship is what we call a transactional relationship. And these relationships are basically formed within any industry. So I'm in the logistics industry, and this is how we base from a commercial aspect the relationship that customer relationship managers have with the customer. Remember, in this case, we are the suppliers from a logistics perspective, and we obviously need to have an interaction with our customer, who's the buyer. And I always sit down with like a customer relationship manager, and we categorize the relationship with the customer based on these three elements. Okay, so the first one is transactional. So this is what in theoretical terms is called an arm's length relationship. We also call it like a muffin meeting, where you basically just have like a coffee and tea. There's not much interaction. You're selling a product at a price, and your buyer is buying it at that price. There's no sort of interaction on negotiation, or you're playing off, or you're basically just playing off suppliers with each other. You're not sitting down and understanding what is your supplier's different attributes, how can they contribute to your business, how can they benefit you from a cash flow perspective or a balance sheet perspective. You just interacting with this individual as just a buyer and a seller without any sort of intimate relationship with them. Okay. Then we go on to something called a collaborative relationship. So a collaborative relationship is where your buyer and your seller basically work really close with each other, and they communicate a lot of different information about the businesses. So whether it is on a monthly basis, they're having different KPI reports or SLA meetings where they are speaking about how the buyer's business is doing, how the seller's business is doing, how they're contributing to helping each other's business. So these are sort of the meetings you would be having. So they have a very good understanding between both parties. So they understand what the challenges are that are in the industry for both the organizations. And they also collaborate a lot. So whether it comes to maybe the development of a new product, they plan together, they collab together, and they try and find something that's cross-functional for both parties. So each stakeholder, from a buyer or a seller perspective, they do their own sort of planning. They don't really integrate in each other's sort of plans, but they come in and they share ideas after the plans sort of like formulated. And then the last one that we have is a strategic alliance. So it's a very strategic relationship. And this is sort of the relationship where you either are sitting in from a top management perspective, either the owner of the business, an MD, a CEO level, someone in a higher management. That's where your relationship is basically sitting. And here you go far beyond any transactional or collaborative sort of relationship. And the entire goal here is to understand what the different risks and the benefits are between both the businesses. So whether it's from a supplier perspective or a buyer's perspective, you need to understand what the risk and the benefit is for both in this sort of partnership. And basically, they have the same goal. They want to be part of each other's business. They want to be able to make a difference. One wants to deliver the goods and services on time. They want to also meet the different standards in terms of quality. So there's a lot more relationship and strategy that's being formulated between both parties together, as opposed to from a separate entity perspective. Okay. Any questions on the type of suppliers? Okay. Okay, then we want to speak about strategic importance of supplier relationship management. And I think from supplier relationship management, it has evolved quite rapidly over the last few years. And I think COVID has attributed towards it, because a lot of businesses were supported by their suppliers, especially during COVID, whether it was from a communicative perspective, whether it was a delivery perspective, or whether it was just something that was exceptional. You had to make an exception for a specific product that you had to deliver. So it has evolved over time, and it has taken a lot more importance sort of post-COVID, and even during COVID, than it probably did, more than 6 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago. So the first one is value of the supplier relationship supplier relationship management. And here we look at some of like the sort of cross-functional relationship between different suppliers, and sort of the value that it creates between the two businesses. You want to understand what the value of your supplier is in your business, and you need to look at different avenues of what benefit they actually give to you. So you need to put enough value to them. So if I have to give you an example from a logistics perspective, for instance, I've got a customer that is part of the e-commerce industry, and during Black Friday, they had a huge amount of volume, especially during Black Friday, and they weren't able to cope. So as a supplier from a logistics perspective, they called me up and they asked me, I have never thought that I could be pushing out 1,000 shipments a day. How can you help me, because I cannot cope? So we had to strategize. It may have been a little reactive than proactive, because they obviously didn't expect this type of volume. Based on that, I had to now make arrangements. Can I put in more resources? How can I change how the operational structure of my side of the business is working, just so that I can alleviate some pressure from them? So I have now created a value for myself within their business. So it's how can you now, as a supplier, have value in your buyer's organization? Okay. Then we look at sort of the benefits when we're talking about a supplier relationship specifically. And when we talk about this, and you'll see as we go along, and I mean, the first 2 slides that we did, it is fairly simple to understand. And I always say this, and I think this is from the beginning of the semester, whenever you're looking at supply chain and the different topics of it, try and put yourself in the common world to understand how supply chain actually works in whether you walk out the door and go down to the shop, what is the supply chain of this business? Or you order something online and think about how it actually gets delivered to your door. And I'm not just talking about the logistics aspect of it, I'm talking about like the picking and the packing, and maybe even as far as how did this company that I order from actually get these products? Did they import the products? Did they import it as raw material? Do they have manufacturing? Is it manufacturing in South Africa? Or do they use it from a cross-border perspective? Maybe they send all of their materials over to Swaziland and Lesotho, who manufacture it, and then they import it back into South Africa, and then they do distribution. So you need to be sort of, the wheel needs to be turning when you purchase any product, or you walk out the door and you see some wheel turning on the, on a vehicle. How did this happen? What is the supply chain of it? How does it now function? And how do we now have this product in front of us? So you need to look at it from that perspective. Right. So when we talk about the benefits of supply chain, we want to understand how best, from a supplier perspective, they contribute towards the buyers, reducing the costs for them, how best their business is optimized, how best they increase performance within their organization. So all of these factors, a supplier needs to contribute towards the buyer's organization and benefit the buyer. So you need to manage this relationship with the supplier as effectively as possible in order for you to have the benefits of reduced costs and optimization. Okay. And some of the benefits is, it's simple stuff. How best can you communicate with your supplier? You want to have a relationship that's integrated with your supplier, where you are constantly communicating, whether you have a disruption in your supply chain. And I know when I first started in the logistics industry, I hated giving bad news to customers. So if something was delayed, I would ooh and ah and find something else to do before I picked up the phone and said, I'm so sorry, but your container has arrived late at the port, or the driver's delayed in having things delivered to you. You always try, and as a supplier, I know, especially when you're delivering bad news, you tend to take 5 steps back. And I have learned through experience over the years that the first thing you should do is communicate with the customer. And I think that's every business, because even me as a consumer and as a buyer, if I order something online and my stuff's not going to be delivered on the day that they tell me it's going to be delivered, I expect a message or an email communicating this information to me. Because if it's communicated to me, I tend to not react in a negative way if I do have to contact the company. So you want to have the best communication as possible, so that if there is any sort of disruptions in the supply chain itself, with the supplier delivering items through to you, you can make alternative arrangements, whether it is you speaking to your customer to tell them that the product's going to be delayed, or maybe you have buffer stock that's lying in the warehouse that you could use first before your consignment actually comes into play. So there's a I'm so sorry. I think my Wi-Fi just dropped there. Let me just share my screen again. Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. Let me just share my screen quickly and we can start where we stopped. Okay, there we go. I just want to see if this is recording. Ah, it is. Perfect. Okay, so we were on benefits of supplier relationship management. So the first one is we want to talk about is better communication. Which we went through, just making sure that if there is any delays, you're communicating it to your customer so they can make any alternative arrangements. The next one is you want to be on time. You don't want to be giving your customer any sort of delays in terms of delivery. So if they've ordered raw materials from you as a supplier, you want to give them an on-time delivery. If you have any late deliveries, unfortunately, this can disrupt your buyer or your customer's entire supply chain. And when they get dissatisfied, and especially if you aren't the only supplier of those items, customers can very quickly chop you up. Um, and I know I keep going back to logistics because I am in that environment, but the logistics environment is something that is so cutthroat. There is almost 5 million different competitors. And I don't even think I'm exaggerating when I'm saying this, but every man with a van is a competitor, and or a truck is a competitor. And unfortunately, you are as only as good as your last shipment. And if your last shipment was bad, your customers holding that against you. So you want to make sure that you are on, best foot forward. But it helps if you have good relationships because your customers tend to forgive you, and if you communicate with them. But if it continuously happens, imagine me delivering a shipment to a customer late 100% of the time. The customer is no longer going to use me because I'm disrupting his supply chain, I'm affecting his business, I'm affecting his revenue, his profit, his cash flow, everything. And it's because of a supplier and not because of him. So we want to make sure that you're pushing an on-time delivery for any sort of material for your customer. You want to also have a good brand image. So, and, whether it is having, a good reputation or good customer satisfaction behind your belt, it's always nice. So customer satisfaction, you can only get that if you are providing good service, whether it's good quality products, good quality raw materials, and on time, or good services. You want to have as minimal disruption in the supply chain as possible, because customers do lose trust in you, especially when you are consistently providing bad service. You also want to look at having like price discounts or possibly deals. I know from a logistics perspective, everything is customized. So if you go to customer A, they'll be on a rate, customer B will be on a different rate, customer C will be on a different rate. And it's obviously based on volumes and economies of scale. So you want to have a good enough relationship between supplier and customer to have better planning for your economies of scale. You want to be able to negotiate these rates, have better buying power, offer them bulk discounts if need be. And it can only happen if you have this one-on-one interaction with your customer, and your customer is sort of giving you enough information and business in order for you to push better deals their way. Okay. And then you want to have better cost savings. Overall, from a bigger picture perspective, the relationship with the supplier does not basically mean that you're not going to have any errors or any delays or disruptions, etc. You want to have a relationship that's quite supportive, so that you can work with your customer, between a customer and a supplier, to make sure that it doesn't happen in the future. So you want to iron out as many pieces. And I mean, this is where SOPs come into play. You want to put together a good standard operating procedure so that what happened last week doesn't happen again this week. But if it's consistently happening, unfortunately, your customer tends to look at competitors as opposed to you. Okay. Then we want to look at the different challenges of supplier relationship management. And basically how this works is you want to, if you do have like bad service or you're not able to provide all the good benefits to your customer, you create a lot of barriers to exit. So you want the relationship between supplier and customer to drive sort of, from a long-term perspective, so that you can build your supplier, or your customer is basically dependent on you as a supplier. So if I have to look at it, okay, I'll mention from like my top 10 customers that I have. I've built relationships from a strategic perspective, meaning that I'm speaking to people that I should be speaking to. I'm not walking in there and speaking to a pick and packer. I'm speaking to someone on a CEO or an MD level. We're speaking strategy, we're speaking planning, we're speaking future, we're speaking about expansion into Africa, for instance, or how do we develop certain lanes into different countries. That's the conversations that we're having. So I become an element of their business from a logistics perspective. I'm just not a supplier that walks in there saying, hi, how are you? How's the kids? Yes, I do that, but it goes further than that. So you want to create something where there's a barrier so that you cannot exit. Okay, you will be their supplier for life. My top 10 customers are basically there since before I started with the business. And I'm in the business for 12 years now. So it is very long-term partnerships. And it's also partnerships that should not be taken for granted. When you do know customers for this long period of time, what happens is you get very complacent. So you tend to just be going to these meetings without being prepared for it, because he's my friend. I know him for X amount of years now, and that should never be taken for granted. There should always be a planning and a research element behind having strategic business meetings with customers, because it only helps you not only but for development and expansion for that customer itself. So there's something developed on my side. Let's say, for instance, we opened 5. Has ever looked at import from China? No. So how can I get him to now start looking at supply? So these are conversations you need to open up. Okay. I spoke about complacency, and also you want to be able to, from a customer perspective, be able to choose a supplier, the right supplier the first time. You don't want to be chopping and changing, because everybody now gets used to what your supply chain is. So you want to create a relationship with the customer that is there for the long term, and you're not there just because you're cheaper than everybody else. You're there because you can make a difference in the buyer's organization. So you need to be able to meet what their sort of SLAs are, or the SOPs are. You need to tick the box in terms of what criteria they're setting out for, what a good supplier means for their business as a buyer. And remember, changing a supplier specifically for a business is a very difficult process. It goes through RFPs or RFQs. You tend to have long discussions with multiple businesses to basically do a particular function in your organization, or supply a particular item to your organization. So you want to make sure that you're not doing this every year or every 6 months. You want to be able to find someone who's right the first time so that you aren't going down this road again. Okay, I hope that made sense. Okay, then we have two different approaches when we look at SRM. Okay, so a business itself has a sourcing strategy, and it will basically dictate the sort of way in which they manage relationships with their suppliers, and how they partner with their suppliers so that they can get growth within their business. So the first one is what is called a reactive approach. Okay, so the business basically chooses to have a specific relationship with the supplier where they only respond to issues when it occurs. So here it's basically you just eliminating any sort of problem that occurred now. And it's like, firefighting, basically. If there's a fire, you call the fire brigade, comes in, puts out the fire, and that's it. And needless to say, majority of every supplier's customer base is this sort of approach, where you go in or you get called on only when there is a problem. You tend to not have that sort of strategic relationship specifically where you are meeting them on a regular basis. You basically, your number's in their phone only for when there's a problem for you to basically put out. Um, so this sort of approach from a reactive side goes hand in hand with having a transactional uh, 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 transactional relationship where it's there just as a sort of handshake. You have maybe one interaction every quarter. You go in there for a quick, coffee and muffin, quick chat, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and you're out of the door. So this is where sort of reactiveness comes into play. And then the next approach is called a proactive approach. So with the proactive approach, it is obviously you go down a procurement strategy. So before you even decide on what supply is on your supplier list, you develop a procurement strategy. With the procurement strategy, you have a whole lot of KPIs that the supplier now needs to take. And then you try and do it right the first time by bringing on a supplier that will, minimize the risk in your business, and be able to carry out your supply chain without any disruptions. And here we want to think of it more from a strategic perspective, where in the long term, you want to have a supplier development program. So continuously you're developing your supplier to be better. Anything that's wrong, you're fixing it. You're not just calling a supplier when there's a problem. So from a strategic perspective, when you look at the strategic alliance from a relationship side, this goes hand in hand with your proactive approach. And in this approach, when you go, let's say you have a bi-monthly meeting with a customer, and I'm speaking again from a logistics perspective. If I walk into a customer and let's say it's the end of the month, I look at the whole of April, how many shipments they did, when it was delivered, when I got a POD for them, what problems are faced, where was the biggest route that I delivered to. So I have all my information ready and I now put it on like a Power BI presentation, and I now share this information with them. And then we look at different strategies. Maybe we're looking at if they are using, let's say, for instance, it's a customer based in Durban and the biggest lane is Cape Town. Why don't we look at decentralized warehousing in Cape Town where they have cheaper logistics costs, meaning that we move product into a warehouse in Cape Town, we store it there, and then we basically pick, pack, and deliver from that Cape Town facility, which means that they have faster to market because they're now getting it there either same day or next day, as opposed to a 3-day transit from Durban to Cape Town. Or secondly, they're getting a cheaper rate because Cape Town to Cape Town is a much cheaper rate than Durban to Cape Town is. So yes, that does offset against the warehousing costs, but maybe we can look at, using a different strategy on how we're using a variable costing model as opposed to having a fixed warehouse cost. So these are sort of the conversations that we open up, especially when the relationship is on a strategic level. You want to look at maybe better packaging. Let's say the density from a packaging perspective is they got a little, we almost, most of everybody orders from Take a Lot. You got a little pin that's packed in a box that's 20 kgs, volumetric. How can we better densify your box so that you're actually paying cheaper from a logistics perspective? Because every logistics company works on weight and not on number of products that you're sending. So this is the types of conversations that you want to have with your specific customer when you are sitting across each other from a strategic perspective, and you also have a proactive approach with it. You going to your customer as a supplier with ideas of how better to improve their businesses, their cash flow, and reduce cost within their business. It does stand for a lot because you basically become an extension of their business, and they tend to respect you a whole lot more. Okay. Then we're going to talk about the process. Okay. So the SRM process specifically. So, the process itself is, when we're talking about supplier relationships, it should be something that's strategic. It should be something that has a process involved in it. It should be beneficial to both parties. There should be value creation for both parties. And it should have mutual benefit as like the main source of reasoning between the two. So when we look at it, the first one that we're going to look at is segmentation. And when we look at segmentation, it's segmenting of the supplier base for the business itself, okay, to prioritize different items that the suppliers are, supplying to them. So, for instance, the business then directs all of its efforts towards suppliers that have the highest impact on their business from a profitability perspective, or is mutually more beneficial to them. And then the ones that are from a lower perspective, meaning giving them the least amount of benefit, you put that sort of in the bottom of the list in an SRM category. So, for example, I have a customer that is in the medical industry, and I would say, top to middle level on their supplier list in terms of my benefit to their business. Actually, I'll say more on top, and spend. Okay, so how much they spend with me, as well as the benefit that I provide to the business. So let's say I'm on the top of their list. Based on me being on top of the list, the expectation is that as a business, I need to be a triple BE provider to them. That's at a lower level. So a level that's like 2 and below, because I now contribute towards what their triple BE impact is. So the expectation is that I need to be at a low score as opposed to a higher score. Whereas if I was at the bottom of the list from a spend perspective and a benefit perspective, then I probably won't be having this conversation with the customer, because I'm not impacting their business a whole lot. I don't interact with them too much. Therefore, whether I'm a 6 or a 1 doesn't really impact their business that much. So segmentation can happen for a lot of reasons. It can happen from an SRM perspective. You obviously want to see the supplier that you spend the most amount of money with as often as possible. And probably the one that you spend the least amount of money with, you don't really care. It basically becomes a firefighting relationship. And then from a South African perspective, it's probably from a triple BEE perspective. Okay. Number two is objectives. So the aim of setting an objective for the sort of from an SRM perspective is to understand what the expectations are for the supplier so that both parties can agree on. So you want to have some sort of structure in place where you can use different KPIs or different criterias that you set out from an objective side from the time a supplier starts or to the end of their or the termination of their contract. So you want to understand whether, what's the risk with their business, how much of value they create for you, are they saving you money from a cost perspective, or are they, charging you more and still costing you as a byproduct? And what is their sort of innovation? Are they coming to you with new ideas of how you can better service your customers or how better you can manufacture your product? So these are the sort of like some of the objectives that you want to look at. Look at what the expectations are that you have as a business for your supplier itself. And be clear and be communicative about it. Set regular meetings where you are now going through these objectives or goals or expectations with them so that they understand at the end of the day what they're fulfilling and what they aren't fulfilling. Maybe they need to pull up their socks on something. Maybe they need to take the pressure off something else. And it does help from a supplier perspective to 100% have these expectations in place and these objectives in place. If me as a supplier, again in the logistics framework, if I have to tick all of the boxes that my customer has set out from an objective perspective, it's very easy for me to go in 12 months from now and walk in there with a 7% increase and say, I have ticked all the boxes in terms of what your objectives are. I now have an expectation of a 7% rate increase. Please, can you give this to me? So the customer, you have basically a negotiation tool with your customer now. Okay. Step 3 is activities. So basically having these different, this partnership, you want to have as much meetings, etc., as possible so that you can optimize any opportunities that either party sees in the industry itself. So you want to be as collaborative as possible, and you want to have very clear objectives with, the people that are specialists in their specific organizations. You want to do a lot of relationship building through these meetings. You want to do a lot of risk management where you're sharing information, you're monitoring your supply chain, and you identifying any sort of projects that come into play that can impact both your businesses from a positive perspective. I think from here, the key objective is you need to be able to meet the customer's requirements as effectively as possible and as and to optimize costs as much as possible, whether it means sourcing materials or delivering a product or doing waste disposal, whatever it is, you need to be able to meet that customer's expectations completely. And then the fourth one is evaluation. So supply evaluation means you need to constantly be having a regular track. You need to be monitoring your suppliers' performance. You need to have review meetings with your suppliers. So if there is any shortfalls, you're able to rectify it as quickly as possible. So the evaluation should 100% be part of the SRM process. And it should highlight any areas that your supplier has proven to be really good or excellent in, so that they can specialize in that specific aspect for you. Or if they're not really good at it and you've given them an opportunity to be better at it and they haven't, then how best can you bring in another supplier to now do that? And it happens with various companies. It does happen where you are splitting business just because it makes sense. Not everyone's always good everywhere. So it does make sense sometimes to have that split, that split process. So you want to push the SRM process as best as possible, segmenting in terms of looking at your top supplier, more often bottom supplier, more from a firefighting perspective, making sure that they have these objectives set out and these expectations set out, having regular meetings, and then tracking it and giving feedback if they are performing or if they aren't performing. Okay. And then we want to look at, and I think this is the last one, is how best can we improve supplier management systems. So we do know that it's quite an integral part of, the relationship between a customer and a buyer. It's quite an integral part of the business and of the supply chain. So we need to make sure that there is continuous supply of goods. There is a continuous provision of services as well. So you need to, constantly be pushing how best can we now improve this. So we want a good procurement process and system so that we can find suppliers that tick the boxes of our objectives, and we can contract them as well, and so that they have the best capability to perform the job function that we require them to do. So the procurement process, a very important process, because it basically starts with you finding the right supplier the first time, basically. Put in all your provisions that you need to, your different criterias, your checklists, etc., but make sure that it's there and it is ticked by the supplier itself. The next one is doing research and development. And this is more for developing the product or the services that could meet the customer's requirements. And this means together. So from a buyer and a supplier perspective, how best can between the both parties do as much research and development just so that you can provide a better product to your customer. When we look at purchasing process and systems, it's for managing the actual supply of material or different services from different suppliers. So we want to make sure that there's improvement from that perspective. Logistics, you want to manage the movement of the goods and services. And you also want to manage inventory from a warehouse perspective, whether it is having a system that's a good warehouse management system, or it's having a good track and trace system, so you're able to give your customer a good timeline that's on track. These are the sort of improvements that we want to look at. And then from an operational perspective, it's more specifically for utilizing the goods and the services that is provided by your supplier to produce the goods that you require so that you can sell them to your customer. So just making sure operationally the wheel is turning there from a manufacturing perspective. Then we have information technology, and this is the exchange of information between both parties, whether it's the supplier exchanging the information, or even if it's having some sort of collaboration of information, meaning integration of two systems, just talking to each other, both from a supply and a buyer perspective. And a lot of times this happens with, from an e-commerce perspective, where you have integrations of different APIs. And with that, when a customer places an order on the customer side or the buyer side, the information pulls through, to the supplier, whether it's a warehousing function, a logistics function, or even just a supplier of product function. All systems are talking to each other. And this happens with APIs, ERP systems, even SAP systems. Information sharing or information technology, to have that exchange of information is very important. And then the last one is having financial processing. And this is more from a managing invoicing or managing different payment processes between a supplier and a buyer specifically. So we need all of these systems and all of these processes to basically work together so that you get the result that you want. You know, your goals are achieved, your objectives are ticked off. So to achieve that supplier integration and that good performance from your supplier, there should be commonality between the buyer and the buyer and the supplier from a systems and a processes perspective. A supplier cannot function on its own, especially if you want to achieve strategic alliance with the buyer. You need to know what their systems are. You need to understand how do you fit in as a supplier. How can you better your system so that your buyer or your customer talks to you better. So there needs to be a lot more integration and a lot more sort of like coordinated approaches between both parties. I think, when we're talking, I wanted to share a little bit of examples with you, but we were speaking on strategic partnerships, strategic alliances, etc. And one example here, and I mean, you can go back and research it as well, but a company like Toyota, for instance, as a car manufacturer, they have very long-term partnerships with some of their key suppliers, especially of like electronic components or engines, or even like seat covers and foam that goes into the seats. They co-develop some of the innovation with Toyota, and they share the forecast, they share production plans, they align strategies, and they try and reduce costs as much as possible. So a lot of Toyota suppliers are like second tier, third tier suppliers that provide these services, and everybody works on it from a strategic perspective. I don't think any supplier of Toyota, even from a logistics perspective, that is there as a firefighting relationship. A lot of the relationships are there from a strategic perspective. Okay. Then I want to give you an example of when you have a collaborative sort of relationship. So, for instance, an example would be Apple. They also have, they work closely with some suppliers like a company called Foxconn, especially when they're looking at it from a design and a manufacturing perspective. So they collaborate a lot on what the product specification is, let's say on the iPhone, whether these are met, what is the fastest sort of innovation cycles. So they collaborate more from a design perspective, but this is how a collaborative sort of meeting then, comes into play. For instance, as well, when we're looking at, whether it's from an innovative sharing side, you want to look at, different types of, like Amazon, for instance, they look at technology and innovation, far beyond a lot of other companies. So here they integrate their logistics software with a lot of their logistics providers so that they can track shipments in real time. They can streamline their fulfillment operations, and they can basically be able to communicate better with their customers. So if you have to order via Amazon, you'll see that it is very communicative because everything is linked. You have one tracking number, which is probably your order number. And based on that, you're able to now see exactly where your shipment is. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of supplier relationship management. Next week, we will be doing customer relationship management, and then we'll look at the different benefits, the different types of relationships as well, and we'll take it from there. But for today, is there any questions? Okay, we're all good. Thank you so much for joining today. I will speak to you guys next week, and we will do Learning Unit 6, Theme 2. But for now, have a good evening, have a wonderful weekend, and we will chat soon. Thank you.